Hey, you guys. All right. If you would like to grab a piece of paper and a pencil, you can. What we're going to talk about here will help you significantly on these questions that you are going to have to do at some point this week. Or, of course, you can just watch and then go back and rewatch if you have a question later. But we are going to really quickly discuss what you have already read, which is pages 95 through 97, about the balance of powers. So this, of course, came from the We the People book that we've used a little bit in class, and it is talking about after the Americans won the American Revolution and they became their own country, and now they have to decide how are we going to set up our country. Now, they actually set up a constitution first called the Articles of Confederation, and it was a disaster. So what we know now as our Constitution was take two. So what we're going to be talking about here was take two. They were like, okay, Articles of Confederation did not work. And so in their minds, they know that that didn't work, and they know from experience how it is to live under a dictator's rule, King George. And so they are trying to make sure that the government that they would make here and would be passed on for other generations would be solid and would be one of their main concerns was that whole dictatorship thing. How can we stop a person like King George from saying he can do anything and going off and making decisions no one else has to agree? How can we stop a person from doing that? So that's how they sort of went into this, is trying to figure out how they're going to limit powers. So they ended up deciding that first, it wasn't just going to be one guy, right? It was going to be 3 levels of government. And so that was a separation of powers. So the president, although, he is the most important guy in the country, his job isn't to do everything in the government. So all of the powers that exist are separated amongst these 3 branches. And I just listed them here on the board. Let me scoot. So the first one was the legislative branch, which is basically Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And their job is to make laws. Now they have a lot of other little side jobs, but their main thing is Congress makes laws. The president doesn't make laws. He has to just sit around and go, you know what? I think this should be it, and I'm going to make it happen. Legislative branch is in charge of making laws. Now, he could suggest it to them, but it is not something that is in his job description. The second branch is the executive branch, and the head of that branch is the president. Also in that branch is the vice president and the cabinet, which are like the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State. They all advise the president. That kind of makes up the executive branch. And their main job is to enforce the laws that were made by Congress. So they have to make sure that people follow through and do the things that were supposed to be done. And then the third branch is the judicial branch, which is really all the federal courts, but the top one, so the top of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. And their job is to settle disputes. So when people say, hey, you broke the law. No, I didn't. I did exactly what the law said, and they argue about it, they have to go to court. And as they go up and up the court system and appeal, like I didn't get the decision I wanted, so I want to hit a higher court to hear it, the very top of that is the Supreme Court. And so they don't hear but just a tiny fraction of the court cases that happen in our country every day, but they hear the ones that are the most disputed because they've been passed up and up the chain. And so people don't really know, was that person following the law or not? They're the ones that have to pull the Constitution out, and they have to decide which one was right, is this constitutional? All right, so those are basically your 3 branches, and that's how the powers are separated. Now they decided we can separate them, but it still isn't going to keep one person or one branch from really getting a lot of power. So we also need to balance it. And I really like this picture because it shows you like a little scale, and they should all be even. So that looks like the executive branch. there's the judicial branch, sorry about that, and there is the legislative branch. So one is not more powerful than the other, even though you might think that they are. They're not. So they balance them by making sure that each one has a way to check the other. Okay, so we're going to talk about some examples of that. And they didn't give you a ton of examples in the pages, so I'm going to read you a few. So the legislative branch. We know that the legislative branch makes laws. That's kind of their thing, right? But they also can propose amendments to the Constitution. They also can impeach a president if they think that he has committed a crime or treason, which is basically betraying your country. And they have the power to impeach him. No one else has to, like the judicial branch has nothing to do with that. I mean, the executive branch, that's him, right? The legislative branch alone can say, we don't think the president is following the law, and so we're going to impeach him. They also, and they hardly ever do it, I want to say it's been the early 1800s since it was attempted, but they also can impeach a federal judge, including a Supreme Court justice, if they think that that person is not acting within the Constitution. So it doesn't happen often, but they do have the power to do that. And that's how the legislative branch checks the executive branch, impeachment, and can check the judicial branch also by impeachment. And then there's one other that we're going to talk about in just a second, but I have to get to the executive branch for it to make sense. So the executive branch, how do they check the others? So the executive branch checks the judicial branch because the president actually appoints federal judges. He gets to say, I would like this person to be the next Supreme Court justice. Now, Congress has to approve that person. So that's another way the legislative branch checks the executive branch, right? But the executive branch appoints the justices. That's how they have a check over the Supreme Court or the judicial branch. Now, this gets a little confusing. So legislative branch makes laws. After they have voted on a law, and let's say they have to have at least 50% of the House of Representatives say, we want that law. Then it gets sent to the Senate. They talk about it. They say, oh, we like it too. So 50% of them, 51%, let's say we like it. And then it goes to the president's desk and he has to sign it. This is how he can check the legislative branch. He can veto it and say, no, I know y'all like it, but I don't. And he can sign a veto. So he, in that way, checks the legislative branch. Now, the legislative branch gets it back. And they have the law or the proposed law. They have notes from the president of why he doesn't think it's a good idea, why he doesn't like it. And then they have to talk about it again. And if the legislative branch can have 2/3 of the House of Representatives say, we still like it, it gets sent to the Senate. If in the Senate, they say, 2/3 of them at least, say, we like it too, then it doesn't matter what the president thinks. The bill still passes and becomes a law. So that's another way the legislative checks the executive after the executive just checked the legislative. They have to kind of agree on some things. And he can also make foreign treaties, the executive branch, which is another way that they check. All right, judicial. So this is the Supreme Court. So one of their main things is that they can declare that a law is unconstitutional. It does not happen in the time when it's becoming a law, but if the Congress makes a law, they approve it, the president approves it, it becomes a law, and then somewhere out in the world, somebody says, you know what, that is not constitutional. Like let's say, since we're in Texas, I'm going to use this as an example. Let's say they passed a law that you cannot keep ammunition at your house. They just say no, it's not safe. They passed the law. Someone, certainly from Texas, would say, wait a minute, that is not constitutional. And they would go and try to get a judge to say whether it was. It would make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would open up their Constitution and they would go, oh, look, Amendment 2, it's not constitutional, and they nixed the law. So even though both of those thought it was a good idea, they can say it's not, and it's not constitutional. It can't be a law. So that's the way judicial checks both of the others, honestly. And then they can also rule that a presidential action was unconstitutional. So sometimes, and I think that we are kind of seeing some of this right now in our world, if you pay attention, during some kind of emergency or some kind of national terrible thing, presidents get a little more power on some things. They can make these constitutional, or they can make these like statements that say we have to do this, when normally they would not do that. But because it needs to be speedily done, they get a little more power. And so if something like that happened and people thought that really is not constitutional, the Supreme Court can come back and say you cannot do that. And that's how they check the executive branch. And then this one's kind of interesting. So the president appoints Supreme Court justices. The president cannot fire a Supreme Court justice. The only way a Supreme Court justice leaves, most of the time, they retire or they die. But they can be removed through impeachment from the legislative branch, but they cannot be fired by the executive branch. So they're kind of they don't have to worry then about making the president mad and him turning around and firing them, right? That's another way to balance powers. Can't be scared of each other. All right, so I think that really is all that we read about. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know. And remember, when you answer your questions on page 98, just the top 4, just write them on a piece of paper and send me a copy of it. If you're writing on a piece of paper with a pencil or a pen, cursive, nice and neat, where I can read it, you can type it and send it to me. That's fine too. I hope everyone has a great Wednesday. Bye.